Yeah, so I can put it in my stories.
Good afternoon. My name is Sarah Casada, and I'm so glad that you guys are joining us, whether right now on Facebook Live or watching the replay later. I'm so excited to be joined by Shannan Martin, who is an author and a writer and just all around great person who I'm grateful to have on today to talk about all kinds of good things like neighboring and ministry of ordinary spaces and places. She recently came out with her second book, which I'm going to show you a picture of because I like to bring visual aids. This is called The Ministry of Ordinary Places. And thanks to the sticker, you can see I got an advanced copy. So I got to read it a couple months ago and was so delighted. And I'm so glad Shannan is here. So Shannan, if you just want to say hello, introduce yourself for anyone who has not read your beautiful words yet.
Yes. Well, Sarah, it's fun to see you today. I am Shannan Martin. I live in Goshen, Indiana. So it's starting to get cold here up in the northern part of the state. I live here with my husband, Corey. He's the chaplain of our county jail. And then we have 4 kids, all of whom came to us through adoption. Our oldest is 24 and he's kind of out on his own. And then we have 3 here at home with us. Calvin is 13, Ruby is 12, Silas is 10. And yeah, we live in our neighborhood that we love so much. And so I write a lot about neighboring and all of these things that we're going to talk about today.
Yeah, so I think I came across Shannan's writing through a friend, all of us who've made very similar choices to live in different types of communities than maybe what people would expect, made different kind of choices where we've planted ourselves in our lives. And so it's always such a joy to read those perspectives that kind of grow out of living cross-culturally, living among the poor, all those kinds of different, I would just want to use the word place. It's very place-based. And so it actually, I was thinking today, I was like, it's so perfect that I'm talking to Shannan this afternoon because we're 2 days post-election. And I feel like whether the people we voted for won or lost, there's just this bigness and this overwhelm that I think many of us can resonate with of just being able to tick off what the problems are that we're facing as a family or as a country, and sometimes feeling very overwhelmed at that and thinking, what do we do? How do we get involved? What does this look like? Or do I just turn on Netflix and let it all just burn down around me? And so I wanted to kind of ask you a little bit about that, because what I loved about your book was this focus on, so it's called The Ministry of Ordinary Places, Waking Up to God's Goodness All Around You. And it's really kind of focused, I want to use the word small, but not in a diminishing way. Yeah. And so kind of maybe speak to how you juxtapose the bigness and the overwhelm with also the place-based smallness.
Yeah, that's really the heartbeat of this book. And it's really where this was born kind of within me was 2 years ago. Like you said, it doesn't matter who we're voting for or, are we happy with the outcome of the election or are we not? I think no matter where we fall on that, there's this real clear sense of fracture in our country. There's this real sense of feeling kind of like the problems are really big up here. And so, coming out of that election 2 years ago was when I started to really feel some of that myself. And I'm not typically somebody who's really prone to just feeling overwhelmed by some of this stuff. But I was, I found myself just feeling a little bit like, kind of like you said, Sarah, like, well, there's nothing I can do about this. So, the impulse is there to just throw your hands up. And I found myself feeling that way more and more and, wrestling with my own emotions about it. And what I found was, when that happened time and time again, the solution for me was always to get low to the ground. It was always to really come down to street level, right where I am. A lot of times the stuff that I was sort of fretting about that was existing up here in the atmosphere, when I started to really pay attention to my place, my really ordinary, this is just where I live. It's a place that I love, but it's really nothing special to most of the world. When I started to really be attentive here, a lot of times I could see those things kind of trickling down into my everyday life. And so things that I felt like, well, these problems are too big for me, I guess I'm just going to forget about it. That's not necessarily true. And so I would see kind of glimpses of, just small ways that I could maybe enter in to some of this big stuff. And it was always the solution for me. It was always what made me feel like, I might just be one woman in one ordinary neighborhood, but there are things I can do here that are meaningful. There are really practical ways that I can walk with the people near me. And I think if we all begin to get a little more intentional about doing that, things get better. I mean, I guess I can't say that all the problems disappear or, but I just really started to understand that making the world better for one person really does make the world better just by virtue. So that's where this book was born, is just, what if each of us did that? What if each of us, instead of feeling overwhelmed and like the problems are just too big, what if we stayed low to the ground, like you said, in that small, undiminished way, but just keeping our lives as small as they can and as intentional as we can make them.
The image that came to my mind when you said that is like when a house is on fire and then they tell you to like hit the ground so that you're underneath the smoke so that you can breathe. That's like what I saw in my mind when you talk about just that kind of swirling overwhelm that I know I can relate to, and I'm sure lots of other people can. Part of that's because I write and talk about immigration, which has just been huge, really for a very, very long time, but especially the last 2 years has been very overwhelming. And so it's just, how do you kind of connect to those ways that are right in front of you, where you're putting one foot right in front of the other, building into something that's really good. I think about one of the stories from your book. You talk about a kid in the neighborhood who's struggling in school, and you kind of wanted to get involved, and then you ended up getting very involved. Maybe you want to share a little bit about that story.
Yeah, that's the thing. When we start paying attention, we are going to notice. We're going to notice areas of disrepair or unhealth or whatever we want to say. I mean, we're going to notice problems existing around us, and it sounds sort of basic to say, let's just start paying attention. But I really think that's a very powerful place to start. And it's pretty regular. It's pretty unfancy. But as I was literally, I'm a writer. I work from home. As I found myself just sitting in my living room working, staring out my front windows, I started to notice a child wandering around my neighborhood in the middle of the day when he should have been in school. And so, it's not like I ran out the door that first day and tackled the kid. But I took note of it. I paid attention, and it kept happening and it kept happening. And so then at some point you realize, like, okay, now I have to take action, or I have to tell myself this isn't my problem. I knew.
Excuse
me.
Are
you okay?
Yeah. Sorry about that.
No, you're fine. I knew who he was, but I didn't know him in a very meaningful way.
Yeah.
And so I chose to just, practice the spiritual gift of maternal nosiness, I guess.
I like that a lot.
I just started to ask some questions. My son knew him and his brothers a little bit. This was early in our relationship. And what I discovered was he had been expelled from school as a 7th grader. He was 12 years old and he had been expelled. And so, then these questions come into play. I took that one step over the ledge and I wrestled with it. I mean, there was part of me that was thinking, like, I don't have time for this. He's not my child. I don't want to interfere. I don't want to overstep, all these things that we tell ourselves. Yep. What ended up happening was I started working with his mom, who loves him deeply and, is doing her absolute best with very few resources. And, we just kind of partnered together and started asking the right questions. I just realized that if this was my child, I would be fighting to the death of, for trying to get this resolved. I would not be giving up. And so although it wasn't necessarily my natural instinct, I just committed. I just kind of said, this isn't right. And if it's not right for my child, it's not right for any child. What can we do? And so we just got to work. And it wasn't just me. It wasn't about me. But it was about this kiddo who deserves a chance and who was treated unfairly in some ways and who needed somebody to believe in him. So yeah, it was a trying year in some ways. It really interfered with my plans, my schedule for the year, but it was a really beautiful and meaningful way to really enter into a relationship with this family who we love dearly. Now they've just become a big part of our world. And so I just think sometimes we've got to meddle. Sometimes we've got to believe that it matters, and we've got to ask ourselves, how would we feel if this was our child? How would we feel if we came up against something that we didn't know what to do? Would we want somebody to step in and help us? And I think we would. So that's just what we did. And I'm sure, we did it imperfectly in some ways. But man, I just love him. My family loves him. We love his mom. We love his brothers. And he's just a special kid. He's in 9th grade now, and he's doing really well. So
that's so encouraging to hear.
Yeah.
You said something telling in your description of that story, because you said, I just took one step off the ledge. And I think so often when we're confronted with issues around us that we think this isn't right, this isn't the way it should be, our first question is kind of like, at least mine, I will speak for myself, is like, what is the smallest, least amount of investment I can do to help this situation?
Right.
And then not to say that there's ever anything wrong with donating money or donating backpacks or all of those things. But I think sometimes when we're really looking at what's happening in the world, you can jump off the ledge or you can take a baby step off the ledge. But either way, you're going over.
You're going down.
And it's not convenient. It's, it can be very disruptive. And I think, I don't always want to hear that. I want to hear like, how can I just, do this in a way that fits into my life currently as I have it. And that's just not always the case.
There was the prideful part of me, because I can be, I don't fear conflict. I can be a little direct when I need to be. This prideful part of me believed that once I got involved and, started, meddling in some ways, that things would just change. Like there was a naive, prideful part of me that thought it would maybe take a couple of phone calls and the situation would change. And when that didn't happen, then I was like, oh no, now I'm in it. Yeah. And so, I'm grateful in some ways that I was so wrong about that, because I had a lot to learn from that. So he ended up at my dining room table every day for a couple of hours. And that's not something that was in part of my plan. Yeah. But I think that was, I think we miss out on opportunities for relationship with our neighbors when we think we can just, like you said, like sending money is not a bad thing. Making phone calls is not a bad thing. There are ways to sort of fix small things that come up that don't require our bodies to be taxed or, our schedules to be disrupted. But I think when we allow those things to happen, that's where things get really meaningful pretty quickly.
Yeah. Let me ask you this, because I have heard some of your thoughts on this, and I love talking about it because it's an interesting conversation, right? To talk about how things in the world are so overwhelming.
Yeah.
And one of the ways we can get involved is to get highly engaged and disrupt our entire lives to commit to that. And I think when you're hearing that, it can be a little overwhelming to hear. And so we hear this phrase self-care tossed around a lot when it comes to caring about people on the margins, loving our neighbors, being engaged. But I wrestle with that phrase, and I know you do too. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on how you stay healthy and balanced in
Right.
in the midst of loving your neighbors.
You know, I do have a lot of feelings about this, Sarah. You're right about that.
I love it.
I really struggle with that phrase because I think a lot of times what we mean when we talk about self-care, we're talking about indulging. Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's in and of itself a bad thing. I mean, I certainly indulge in things. As we were chatting before this started today, I had a couple of things fall off of my schedule today, and I went and met my husband for lunch, and that's not something I get to do often. And I'm always really aware of the luxury of that. Like I had the car to go. I had the time. He has a job with some flexibility. We had an extra $20 to spend on lunch. Like I don't take this stuff for granted. And I'm grateful for it. But I cannot help but to see, if we're talking about self-care as Sabbath or rest, which we know is important, and this is something that has been commanded of us, this is something that God wants for us. I can only see that through the lens of my neighbor now. And I do live in a similar existence as you. I do live surrounded by people at the margins. I do live very near people in deep poverty. I do live near, we live in a very immigrant rich neighborhood. I mean, I could go on and on and on. And so it's becoming harder and harder for me to see, indulging in something or luxuriating in something when it doesn't feel like rest is always very attainable for my neighbors. Mm, However, I also know, just last night, and I posted about this on Instagram today, today's the day where I'm taking 1 million stories for this special hashtag, which is why I took your picture in the beginning. I mean, we're sharing glimpses of our day, but the thing I shared about this morning is I'm aware that my life is really full, with my husband being the chaplain, with all these different things happening. We have a lot of people in our life who rely on us for certain things. Now, we try to also rely on them. So there's that whole conversation that we don't really have time for right now. But for me, taking care of myself means sometimes ignoring the housework that needs to be done because I need to sit on the couch until 11 o'clock at night and watch TV with Corey or read a book or whatever. But there's something that's got to give, I mean, I don't have people coming in to clean my house. And I'm always kind of negotiating. I think any type of work that requires us to sort of embody the idea of being in proximity with the poor, or being in proximity with people who struggle, it can be pretty taxing. Yeah. It can be pretty mentally draining. It can be physically overwhelming at times. And so there is a place for having quiet when you can decompress and kind of push it all off to the side. I just don't know that I like to call that self-care. I like to call that just being a person. Like I am a human being. I am a woman. And so I can choose at night whether to clean my kitchen or whether to sit and veg with my husband. And most of the time I'm going to veg with my husband and the dishes will get done. It's just negotiating kind of some space for what you need to get your rest, to get going again the next day.
Absolutely. Last night I fell asleep at 9 p.m.
See?
And I was like, oh, I shouldn't take that for granted that sometimes I genuinely need just straight up sleep.
Right.
And all of those things that I don't necessarily in my mind define that as self-care, but I think that probably is caring for myself more than some of the ways that language is used. And so it's just really important.
Yeah.
The last question I wanted to ask you before we wrap things up is about your church, because one of the things I loved about all of your writing, but was definitely a big thread in this book, is your love of your church in all of its misfit glory. And so I'd like you to just talk a little bit about that and kind of, and I think you talk about this, how for a while you guys weren't sure about church or that place. And so I think, how you found a rootedness there. I'd love to hear.
Right. Yeah, no, I love to talk about church. You're right. I wrote a lot about it. Here, I'll hold up my copy too.
Yay.
When we arrived in this neighborhood, it's been 6 years now. So it's very, that's the other thing is that in year one, this was very new and it was very unfamiliar and exciting. And now it's very ordinary. This is our life and we love it. And so it's like, now what? Now what do we do here? One of the things we knew is that when we moved to this neighborhood, we wanted to be involved in a church in our community. We didn't necessarily plan to land at the church on my street. So it's a block and a half away. My whole world is quite small, distance wise. Everything's kind of right here now, which I really love. But we did land at this very tiny Methodist congregation. It had at the time maybe 50 people who showed up on a typical Sunday. It was mostly elderly people. And we knew immediately, in the way that you just know these things, that this was going to be our church home. And for the first year, it was glorious and, surprising and different. And then things started to fall apart a little bit. Yeah. There were changes in the pastor. There were issues. There was a church split in a church that really couldn't sustain a split. And so we did go into this time, and it was, when I say like time, it was like 2 years of just struggle, 2 years of just almost like begging God, like, just send us away from here. We never felt a clear, like, okay, now it's time for us to go. And honestly, the reason that we had such a hard time walking away was because this church was our neighbor. It all becomes so much more personal. Like we had a hard time on our own, just walking away from our neighbor. And so we stuck it out. We wore our friends out, who don't attend church with us, but like talking it to death. I mean, our friends were finally like, just maybe leave. Maybe you're just so happy there and you should go. But we stuck around and slowly my church came back to life through our neighborhood work release center, which is basically a facility for people who are incarcerated but get to leave to go to work in church. So now, we're a couple years after the fact. And, last Sunday we had 130 people. It's still a small church. But we were just right on the verge of just the doors were going to be closed and the church was going to be gone. And so it's very special that the thing that brought us back to life was people at the margins. These are men and women who are showing up like covered in tattoos, smoking outside before church with some people who attend our church anyway. I mean, it's a very haphazard, special, beautiful place where, the bar is just really set at come as you are. Let's worship together. Let's pray together. Let's hug each other every Sunday. Let's take communion. I look back and I think of how close we were to missing out, like we were just, I think sometimes we just don't stick it out quite long enough. And I think sometimes when we can just endure, just really commit for the long haul, then we get to be a part of the redemption that happens. And so that's church for us. And I love it.
Man, that's such a beautiful picture. And I think that's something that so many of us want, not only out of our church communities, but out of whatever kind of ragtag group of people that are in our lives, as we want to see that kind of redemption and that just authenticity of welcoming people as they are. I think that's a beautiful picture that you've painted, and a perfect way to kind of leave this on a hopeful note. We started out with the heaviness of the political scene, but not to be too cheesy or anything, but I genuinely believe that there is hope in the church and in the margins and in the beauty of people coming together, and that's how we collectively face the things in our society that are weighing down on us.
Right.
And so I think there's something really powerful there. So I want to just again remind everyone that this is Shannan Martin, and her book is called The Ministry of Ordinary Places. I'll put a link in the comments. You can actually enter to win a copy of her book, as well as the some of the other guests we've had doing interviews this fall. And there's just lots of good stuff there, and you will love reading you. And before we sign off.
Are you there? Oh. Sorry. I did not. It got a little glitchy in the last minute, so I didn't hear the last thing you said. If you asked me to do something,
that's okay. I know I suddenly froze. I was just going to ask if you wanted to share where people can find you and follow you.
I'm glad I clarified. Yes, you can find me. I blog still at shannanmartinwrites.com, and it's Shannan with an A at the end, SHANNAN. I'm super active on Instagram, and my secret love is Twitter. I'm at Shannan Writes at both of those places, and I'm certainly on Facebook as well at Shannan Martin Writes. So it's not hard to find me.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for sharing today. And thank you for those of you all who tuned in to watch.
Yes. Thank you, Sarah.
Bye.
See ya.